Now, it's often assumed that men and women react differently in their ease of being able to achieve orgasm, and this may be done in different ways. And I've certainly been very interested to read the writings by Jane Thomas, who sort of came to my awareness a year or so ago, and we've had many conversations by email and in person. And so it's a great pleasure for us to be able to introduce her as our first speaker, helping us understand a little bit more about the complexity of orgasms, particularly for women. And so I would like to welcome Jane to give us our first lecture. Thank you very much.
Great. So, what is sexual pleasure? And do women experience sexual pleasure in the same way that men do? Or is sexual pleasure fundamentally different for women? Some years ago, I wanted to find out some information about female sexuality, and I approached a couple of doctors. The first doctor was a man in his 60s, and he suggested that I went along to the family planning library in central London. Well, I wasn't very enthused by the title. I didn't think it sounded like it had much to do with sexual pleasure or female sexuality. But I went along nevertheless, and I found many books about how a woman can have a baby, how a woman can avoid having a baby, and quite a few books about sexual diseases. But I didn't find one book about sexual pleasure. It was all reproduction and responsibility, no fun. So the next time I approached a doctor, it was a woman in her 30s. And she was unable to help. She told me she had no idea where I could go to find out information about female sexuality. And I realized, of course, as a doctor, she must talk to women more in the context of pregnancy and childbirth. But I also came to appreciate that for women, there's often associations of immorality with sexual pleasure, because it was very evident that she was embarrassed by the question. It was as if I was asking something slightly improper. And I think the reason for this is that sexual pleasure is associated with the sex industry. And the sex industry, both prostitution and pornography, are geared towards primarily the male consumer. And women's role in those industries is to provide pleasure to men for money. So, for example, in pornography, it's geared towards male fantasies. So it's not at all evident that the sexual behaviour of the women involved and their apparent sexual responsiveness reflects the same behaviour and responsiveness of women in real life. In fact, porn offends many women, and so we can deduce from that that pornography almost certainly doesn't reflect women's view of what sexual pleasure is all about. So how do women enjoy sexual pleasure? And in particular, how do they enjoy orgasm with a partner? Well, the first step in enjoying sexual pleasure and orgasm is that you're motivated to do so. So I'm going to start by talking about sexual motivation. Then I'm going to talk about physical stimulation, that is how the body is involved in orgasm. And then about psychological arousal, that is how the mind is involved in orgasm. Next, I will present the research of the two key researchers into female sexuality, that is Alfred Kinsey and Sherry Hite. And finally, I will talk about some of the issues that challenge our ability to enjoy sexual pleasure over the longer term. Sexual motivation. There's often an assumption that we all have an identical sex drive. But Alfred Kinsey spoke to over 12,000 men and women in the United States in the 1940s. And he concluded that there is, in fact, a whole range of sex drives that is perfectly normal for any particular individual. For example, some women orgasm many times a day, and some men only want orgasm once every few weeks, believe it or not. But these are exceptions. And overall, Kinsey concluded that men are significantly more sexual than women, in fact, 6 times more sexual than women. And he measured sexual responsiveness in terms of the incidence of orgasm, that is, how often a person has an orgasm in any given week or month. Male sex drive does decline with age, but even by the age of 60, the sex drive of the average man has still not fallen to the sex drive of the average woman. We live in a very competitive world in which there's often an implication that anyone whose experience lies towards the lower end of any particular scale must in some way be deficient, or that the person is missing out in some way. So I think it's important to say that there is nothing to prove that somebody with a high sex drive is any happier or any better off than somebody with a low sex drive. The American writer Joan Sewell talks confidently about being proud of having a low libido in her book, I'd Rather Eat Chocolate. So gradually, women are asserting their femininity and questioning the portrayals of women in the media as if women behave sexually just as men do. If we look at how women invest their money and time, we don't generally see them on the internet looking out sources of eroticism to assist with their arousal, as men perhaps do. But we do see women investing quite considerable sums of money in makeup and high heels and fashion in order to enhance their attractiveness to men. So a woman's sexual focus is to attract a man's attention, then get him into bed, and that's usually the easy part, and then, much more challenging, keep him interested in having sex with her over the longer term, including responding appreciatively during sex. The British writer, Cathy Lett, is able to put a humorous spin on the difference between the sexes. And she suggests that women today are more interested in a man who can talk to them and even cook, rather than a man who is obsessed with orgasm, particularly his partner's. A woman gets pregnant regardless of whether or not she has an orgasm. So there's no reason for a woman to orgasm by any means. And there's no reason why a woman should be motivated by orgasm at all. So a woman naturally focuses on pleasuring a lover through sex, rather than pleasuring herself. Physical stimulation. I think we'd all agree that there's little debate over the male anatomy involved in male orgasm. However, I think we'd also all agree that there's a lot more contention about the sexual anatomy involved in female orgasm. So which body part does a woman need to stimulate in order to orgasm? Is it her vagina? Is it her clitoris? Or is it some other part of her sexual anatomy? One would have thought that anybody who knows how to orgasm would know which part of their body they needed to stimulate. The fact that there is debate over this most basic of sexual facts indicates the level of misunderstanding about how and when women orgasm. The reason for the confusion is that women do not experience spontaneous arousal as men do, so they don't have the genital focus that men have. Kinsey found for his sample that only around 20% of the women in the sample masturbated regularly. But I think we can conclude that masturbation is much less common in the female population in general, simply because of the taboo over masturbation among heterosexual women. Women who do masturbate know that the clitoris is the source of their orgasm. But when it comes to sex, men's desire for intercourse means that the focus tends to be the vagina. However, it's illogical to believe that a woman orgasms by stimulating her body in one way when alone and in a completely different way when she is with a partner. Sherry Height picked up on Kinsey's finding that female orgasm is most easily achieved through masturbation. And in her work in the 1970s, she focused on the clitoris. But although she was able to confirm that clitoral stimulation leads to orgasm when a woman is alone, she was unable to show that it was as effective with a partner. So, for example, 82% of the women in her sample could masturbate themselves to orgasm using clitoral stimulation. But only 44%, that is roughly half that number, could succeed with orgasm using the same techniques with a partner, that is manual stimulation of the clitoris. And only 42%, again roughly half, could succeed using oral sex, that is oral stimulation of the clitoris by a partner. So the clitoris is clearly the source of female orgasm. We know this from masturbation, female masturbation, but it's no guarantee of orgasm with a partner. Mental turn-ons, psychological arousal. If we think about our favourite meal, we can probably also imagine that we'd enjoy thinking about that meal. And when the meal was being cooked in the kitchen and we could smell the meal, we would also enjoy that in anticipation of eating the meal. Men's experience of sex is similar. Men are aroused not only by sex itself, but also by talking about sex, by portrayals of sex, and even by objects associated with sex, such as women's underwear. Women generally are not aroused by the same stimuli. So what is it about sex? What turn-ons motivate a woman to want sex? And what is it about sex and a partner that causes a woman to be aroused enough to orgasm? Nancy Friday's book, My Secret Garden, highlighted the variety and complexity of women's sexual fantasies. So it's evident that some women use explicitly sexual and adult themes to assist with arousal and orgasm. But not every woman has sexual fantasies. Some women are able to orgasm alone or with a partner without using mental stimuli or fantasy of any kind. But for many of us, sexual pleasure is defined more by what happens in the mind than what happens to the body. If we look at the male experience, men's enjoyment of pornography indicates that they use fantasy to assist with arousal during masturbation. Likewise, men's appreciation of a responsive partner indicates that they need assistance with their fantasy of arousing a woman through intercourse. Female masturbation is quite different to male. For men, sex is always the goal, and masturbation usually a poor substitute. For a woman, masturbation provides an environment devoid of distractions where she can get the intensity of mental focus on the taboo aspects of sex that she finds most arousing in order to achieve orgasm. And this is much more difficult to achieve with the distractions of sexual activity with a partner, where a woman needs to be interactive and respond to a lover. So some women's use of fantasy leads to orgasm when alone, but does not work with a partner. So next I want to present the findings of Kinsey and Haidt in relation to women's experience of orgasm during sex. And there's a fairly even split, as you will see. 50% of women say that it's possible to orgasm with a partner, and 50% of women say that it's not possible to orgasm with a partner. The experience of orgasm with a partner is designated as a normal experience, and the experience of never having an orgasm with a partner is designated as dysfunctional. There is nothing new about this view of female sexuality, and it comes from a male view of women's sexuality, where men assume, because intercourse is arousing for men, that it must be equally arousing for women. Female orgasm is optional. It's not involved in reproduction in any way. So there is no reason to think that a woman is dysfunctional if she doesn't have an orgasm. My view is that it is unhelpful to label such a large proportion of the female population as dysfunctional. I believe that this intimidates women into silence and explains why the most confident people who can talk about female orgasm and who think they know how it should be achieved are in fact men. There are very few women that are confident to stand up and talk about how it's possible to orgasm with a partner. Both of these researchers were criticised because it was felt that their samples were unrepresentative. As I mentioned, in Kinsey's sample, he found around 20% of the women masturbated regularly, and it was considered that this was unrepresentative. But any research that asks about orgasm is likely to attract a disproportionate number of women who masturbate. And the explanation for this is in the research findings themselves. Female orgasm is achieved most easily through masturbation, and therefore women who masturbate are more confident about orgasm. And Sherry Haidt noted that women are often unsure whether they actually orgasm with a partner or whether they simply experience sexual arousal. Regardless of whether women describe sex as orgasmic or not, women do not behave sexually as men do. So, for example, they don't generally pay for sex, and they also often feel exploited by casual sex. Over the longer term, most women prefer to have sex within the context of a relationship. The bravado that we have in society at the moment, which assumes that every woman orgasms every time with a partner, leads to unrealistic expectations, and this causes problems for both men and women in their sexual relationships. So expectations for female orgasm should be reconciled to the sexual attitudes and behaviours of women in real life, and specifically not to those of women in fictional media, such as pornography. So, lastly, I wanted to talk about the concept of give and take in long-term relationships. Given the difference in average sex drive between men and women, the issue of mismatched sex drives is a fact of life for many heterosexual couples. Kinsey acknowledged this 60 years ago, and he commented that it was amazing that couples ever find a solution to this problem. But given the bravado that I referred to earlier, there's a great deal of reluctance to acknowledge this issue. Surprisingly, as Australia is often considered to be a macho nation, Bettina Arndt, who is an Australian therapist, has published a book recently called The Sex Diaries, in which she documents the sex lives of numerous Australian couples and talks about what a huge issue this is for Australian sex therapists. And I think it's great that the Australians at least have acknowledged this fact of life and problem that we all face but don't want to admit. So men tend to focus on orgasm as a means of motivating women to be more interested in sex. But women are not motivated by orgasm in the way that men are. Kinsey found for women who do masturbate that they masturbate about once every 3 to 4 weeks. And this is much less than most men want to be having sex. Sex drive is a feedback loop based on a balance between effort and reward. So for a man, the effort in becoming aroused is relatively little, and the reward of orgasm is considerable because it's so important to men's sense of emotional well-being. For a woman, the reverse is true. The effort of becoming aroused and achieving orgasm is much greater, but orgasm is much less vital to a woman's sense of well-being. It's nice to have, very nice to have, but quite different to the importance that men put on orgasm. Male fantasies pressure women into faking orgasm, and some sources estimate that up to 80% of women fake orgasm regularly. Men need to take the focus off orgasm and invest in making sex more varied and more sensual. They also need to appreciate that women are more amenable to sex when they feel good about their partner and good about the wider relationship. In order to accept this research, we need to face a huge emotional conflict that many people have between fantasy, that is the way we'd like things to be, and reality, that is the way they are. It would be massively convenient if we could wave a magic wand and make women's experience of orgasm happen when we want it to. The research indicates that it happens, unfortunately, much more readily when women are alone. So when it comes to therapy, we need to differentiate between women who are concerned about orgasm itself, in which case they can find out about orgasm through masturbation, or whether couples are more concerned about what a woman needs to feel amenable and good about sex with her partner. Hoping to bring the two together is perhaps hoping for a bit much. So, long-term relationships involve a compromise between men's desire for an active sex life and women's desire for affectionate companionship. And I believe that couples need much more realistic information about the different rewards that men and women can expect from sex to help them build successful long-term relationships. That's it.
Some provocative thoughts and opinion there, which I think would let us ask some questions of Jane, and I'm sure one or two of us would like to challenge or talk about some of the things. Could you just introduce yourself and say who you are, please?
My name's Helena Thornton. I'm just a GP. I'm not
Hi.
a sexual therapist or anything. I find listening to that quite difficult because my experience of being in surgery and my experience of being the age I am and having lived the years I have is quite different from that. I see a lot of couples where the woman wants a lot more sex than the man. And when in a relationship the man wants more sex than the woman, it is fairly easy to find a way to live with that because most women can live with that. But a lot of the pressure on men in relationships where the woman wants more sex than the man, it's then difficult for the man to come up to scratch. I also think that, it's a great shame that we're still using Kinsey, which is nearly 60 years old. And, I have a daughter of 28. I don't talk to her about her sex life, but I look at her friends and I look at Anne Summers and the amount of sex toys and the people that were outside this afternoon. And I can't believe that if Kinsey did his research now, he'd come up with 20% of women masturbate, and on average it's once every 3 weeks. That doesn't seem realistic to me. Now maybe I'm the odd one, but I find that quite...
I think it's important to say that I'm trying to help people that have a problem. So if people don't have a problem, then they don't need the information. What I'm trying to say is that when I had a problem and I went along to try and find out about it, nobody told me about this information, which has been out for 60 years. And I found it amazing that nobody knew about it and nobody would mention it to me. So when somebody specifically has the problem of lack of orgasm during sex, a woman, I mean, obviously, and when a couple has the specific problem of having this mismatch in sex drive, the fact that Kinsey talked about it in such depth and acknowledged it 60 years ago, that seems to have vanished off the face of the earth. And that's what I'm trying to point out, is that it feels, I mean, I'm sure it isn't deliberate, but to me it feels like that information has been repressed and it's just not available. So what I'm trying to do is make that information available to people that need it. And if they don't need it, then great, that's fantastic. But it's trying to put the other point of view. When you talk to women in the Muslim community, what you find is that, a comment that somebody made to me was that Muslim women are not even aware that it's possible to orgasm with a partner. Now, everyone thinks that if you just give them the information, it somehow sort of makes it all right overnight. But all I'm trying to point out is that there is an element of this where what's happened since the sexual revolution is that women have been told that they should orgasm during sex. And so it means that a lot of women approach sex without knowing what orgasm is, and they simply assume that they're having an orgasm. And I think that there's very little appreciation of just how embarrassing the subject is. So what I'm trying to do is get more awareness of the fact that I've spent 10 years trying to find out about this subject and how women actually do it, and nobody will talk about it. So what I'm saying is that if it's so wonderful and so pleasurable, why can nobody tell me, how they do it, or, whatever? And I'm saying that I'm a perfectly normal woman, and, I'm just saying it just seems a little bit odd to me. Every man seems to get it right pretty much first time. So, so what's missing here? And I think by telling people that there's something wrong with them, and if they, got a better partner, or if they, read a book about sex, that it's going to solve the problem. What I'm saying is I haven't done all that, I haven't ditched my partner, but anyway, what I'm saying is that I've done all of that research, I've asked people, and for me, none of it works the way it's supposed to. And I want to get more openness about admitting that, because there seems to be a lot of bravado that's coming to the conversation, and everyone's always got the success stories to tell, which is great. But what about the people that are on the other side of the coin? No one ever thinks, about how they feel. And when I've tried talking to women, what I find the overwhelming thing that really strikes me is how silent women are and how they won't speak up. If you ask a woman about sex, it's really, really difficult. She won't say anything because it's so competitive. And I'm trying to point that out to say that while we keep saying it's perfect, then you don't allow these women to come forward and say, well, actually, it isn't perfect for me.
Jane, we've got one more question. We've got two more questions, but let's let her hear.
Hello, I'm
Hi.
Lynn, and I'm a psychosexual therapist in Oxford. And I actually think your experience parallels mine when I was a young woman in the 1970s, feeling that I had an abnormal body and having imbibed all the myths. I read Kinsey, I read Height, I read a whole lot of other things besides, and that's probably why I'm a psychosexual therapist today. And what I've learned through working in this field is that we have to be careful where we generalize, and I think we have to be very careful about polarizing male and female stereotypes like this, because men are laboring under a similar body of sexual myths and constraints and pressures to women, and it's actually a conjoint struggle to be real in the face of stories we were told and that actually aren't true.
Mm-hmm.
And that you don't empower the woman without empowering the man, and vice versa. I also work with same-sex couples where there are mismatches and desire which have nothing to do with gender. And so I think, as our colleague there said, there are truths, and then there are relative truths, and there are absolute truths, and we need to make a difference between them in order for people to get what they need. And yes, I would agree that Britain is fairly sexually repressed. I grew up in Australia, and we were talking about this stuff years ago. Yeah.
Jane, do you want to respond, or so I'm only going to allow one more question.
I would just repeat the point that this is very much directed towards people who find it useful. So I'm not trying to destroy anyone's
Okay, we've got this
happiness with what
gentleman.
they're happy with.
Yeah, like a consultant endocrinologist, really two brief points. I'm afraid I'm going to disagree with you about the comment about Muslim women, because you need to differentiate between social taboos and Islamic teaching, because even many people don't know in the Quran foreplay is mentioned. That's to start with. The other thing is the Prophet is teaching, encourages kissing the partner before having sex. So it's totally different. So I don't want to go through that discussion. But as an endocrinologist, really, I would say the samples obviously we mentioned, and you yourself have highlighted that people have criticized samples of these studies. But one people obviously assume that they're obviously normal individuals. But in reality, they are not, because some of them will have obviously hormonal deficiencies, and you cannot generalize obviously. However, those who have responded poorly, if they were obviously subjected to an endocrine sort of assessment, you will find sort of problems that are treatable.
I think one of the problems is
a quick response, please.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, quick.
Is that everyone seems to, we've been on the planet having sex for God knows how long it is, thousands of years, but everyone seems to think that female sexuality can have changed, over the last 60 years or something. It strikes me that Kinsey spoke to a lot of women, and there's a very clear message in there that for a lot of women, they find that, masturbation works brilliantly, but it doesn't work with a partner. And that's the only message that I'm trying to get out, is for those women that find that message useful. It's not a mantra. I don't have a political aim. I'm simply trying to help women like myself. I was just amazed in this day and age of the internet and everything else that this information has been buried and lost. What I'm saying is, if it can help people, then why are we ignoring it? If it doesn't help people, then ignore it. Fine.
Okay, thank you. We'll come back for the discussion. We have got time for 25 minutes for the discussion at the end, but I just want to try and keep the times for our speakers. Our next, thank you very much, Jane. That was great.